There's this situation with Marineland in France, a major marine park closing its doors. Now, you might initially think, okay, that's a win for animal rights, maybe, the end of that chapter.
But looking into these reports, it seems the story actually got more concerning after it closed. For the animals still inside, it seems like the closure actually sparked a really severe crisis. And our mission here really is to unpack that, to see how this animal welfare situation connects back to the owner, Parques Reunidos, based on these sources.
And this matters to you listening because, well, it pulls back the curtain on the whole complex relationship between these huge corporations, changing laws like the French one banning whale and dolphin shows, and what actually happens to the animals when a business model just stops.
Exactly. Who's responsible then?
So let's get specific. What do the sources say happened at Marineland? It closed January 5th, 2025.
But then, fast forward just a few months to May 2025, reports started surfacing, and there was footage apparently from a group called Tidebreakers, and it described severe neglect. That's the term used.
Severe neglect of who?
The animals left behind, the last two orcas, Wiki and her son Kaijo, and about 12 dolphins. The reports mentioned them being in these algae-infested tanks.
And the sources suggest this happened because staff were laid off after the closure.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Fewer staff, deteriorating conditions for these animals that need, constant complex care.
It's important to remember this park, it already had a history, didn't it? The sources mentioned deaths over the years.
Oh, absolutely. A long history. The reports mention at least 12 orcas dying there since the 70s. Inuk and Moana were more recent ones, and something like 34 bottlenose dolphins, too, over time.
So with the park closed and conditions declining, what about moving the animals? Were there attempts?
Well, yeah, there were attempts, but they kind of hit roadblocks. Plans to move the orcas to Japan faced a lot of opposition early on. Then more recently, there was a plan to move Wiki, Kaiho, and the dolphins to Spain, Loro Parque, and an aquarium in Madrid.
Okay.
But the Spanish authorities actually blocked it. The reason given, according to the sources, was that the facilities just weren't adequate. They lacked the proper facilities and didn't meet minimum requirements.
Didn't meet minimum requirements, so even other parks weren't deemed suitable. And meanwhile, you have animal welfare organizations, Voice, PETA, Dolphin Project.
Yeah.
They're all pushing for something different.
Exactly. They're advocating for moving these animals to genuine sea sanctuaries, not just transferring them to another commercial park, but a proper sanctuary environment.
Which brings us back to the owner, Parques Reunidos, this massive global company that's owned Marineland since 2006.
That's right. And they're still a huge player, though it's worth noting they sold off their U.S. parks back in March 2025. Seems they're focusing more on Europe now.
So if Marineland's situation is this bad post-closure, does this pattern extend to other places they own or used to own? What do the sources say about their wider portfolio?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, or maybe troubling. The sources suggest it's not just an isolated Marineland issue. Take the Zoo Aquarium Madrid, which they own. A report from April 2025, so quite recent, mentions a sun bear exhibiting pacing.
Pacing, like repetitive movement.
Yeah, exactly. Stereotypic behavior, often linked to stress or poor welfare in captivity. The report also mentioned its deteriorated physical appearance. And that's not all for Madrid. If you go back to 2011 findings mentioned in the sources, there were reports of small enclosures, hygiene issues, and even dolphins with deep abrasions on the rostrums.
Abrasions on their noses from performing.
That seems to be the implication in the report, yes.
Oh,
from performance activities.
Okay. And you mentioned the UK as well, the Oceanarium.
Yes, the Oceanarium in Bournemouth. Another facility linked to Parques Reunidos. The sources flag a really alarming average annual mortality rate there, 26% between 2018 and 2023.
26%.
Yeah.
Annually. That's huge.
It is. And the reports cite reasons like delivery stress, problems with salinity contamination, and also inadequate enclosures for reptiles kept there.
And Blackpool Zoo. Also linked.
Also previously under their umbrella, yes. PETA apparently opposed an elephant enclosure expansion there, citing concerns about zoochosis, that term for those abnormal repetitive behaviors, and mentioning elephant deaths.
So it really does start to look like maybe a pattern here, not just a one-off crisis at Marineland, but potentially wider systemic issues across different facilities connected to this company.
That seems to be what the collection of sources suggests, yeah.
Which makes the contrast quite stark, doesn't it? Because Parques Reunidos, on paper, they talk a good game. They state they have this strong commitment to animal welfare, a 100% animal welfare improvement program, conservation work.
Right. And that's the core tension highlighted in these materials. You have these public commitments, these programs, But then you have the documented reality described in the reports, the neglect at Marineland after it closed, the high mortality rates elsewhere, the stereotypic behaviors, the enclosure issues. It directly contradicts the official statement.
It really makes you question how effective those welfare programs are, or maybe how seriously they're implemented when push comes to shove, like during a closure.
Exactly. And the whole situation, especially with the whales and dolphins at Marineland, just underscores how difficult, maybe impossible, it is to provide genuinely good welfare for these kinds of animals in, well, concrete tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It feeds this whole global conversation about the ethics of marine parks and zoos, and this growing push towards sanctuaries as maybe the only humane alternative.
So when you pull it all together from this deep dive, the sources seem to paint a pretty troubling picture. A pattern of welfare concerns linked to Parques Reunidos leading up to this awful situation at Marineland's post-closure. It shows how corporate decisions, shifts in strategy, closing parks, they have massive, sometimes devastating impacts on the animals caught in the middle.
What responsibility does a corporation like Parques Reunidos truly have to the living beings in their care, especially when the doors close and the profits stop?